Back in October, one of the most important geopolitical basketball games in the history of the world was played in Shanghai, China. It was an exhibition game that featured the Los Angeles Lakers and LeBron James. Just before the game, though, an NBA executive tweeted his support for the Hong Kong protesters who are fighting for freedom and liberty to secede from the totalitarian government in Beijing. But the people of mainland China were outraged by this tweet. And when I say mainland China, Hong Kong is an island, so I'm calling all the people in most of the rest of China mainland China. The people in mainland China were enraged and demanded that the NBA apologize. The NBA refused to apologize, claiming that this is America and we believe in free speech. Our executives have a right to say anything they want. So the people of mainland China decided to not only boycott the basketball game in Shanghai, but to completely boycott the NBA. So it's really great to believe in free speech, but it's really stupid to piss off 1 billion customers. Now, LeBron James himself, who has traveled extensively in Hong Kong and China, came out and said that he doesn't think the NBA has any idea what's actually going on in Hong Kong. LeBron was lambasted by the mainstream media for refusing to stand up for free speech and liberty. There were memes going around everywhere showing LeBron James looking like Mao Zedong, and the Hong Kong protesters publicly burned a LeBron James jersey. Now, other black athletes, such as Colin Kaepernick, when they exercise their right of free speech and refuse to stand up for the national anthem, were blacklisted. He was blacklisted from his profession. So in America, it's all right to have free speech as long as it's the correct free speech. Now, the mainstream media of the United States claims that the people of mainland China have no idea what's actually going on in Hong Kong because all they get is censored news. Actually, the people of mainland China know much more about their own history than we Americans know about our history because what we get is censored news. For instance, the people of China know about the 100 years of humiliation. From the middle of the 1800s until 1949, when the Chinese kicked the Americans out of their country, all of the Western powers, including the United States, had carved up China, plundered it, humiliated the Chinese people, and tried to turn China into an impoverished colony of the West, much as they had done to much of the rest of the world. The British Empire, the most brutal drug cartel of all time, was producing opium nearby in India with slave labor, and they were selling it in China. The Emperor of China saw that his people were becoming opium addicts. He tried to stop the British from selling the opium there. The British then attacked China in the Opium Wars, forced them to take the opium, and then punished China by stealing the very important Chinese port city of Hong Kong. And it wasn't until 1997, when the British Empire had shrunk back to being this tiny little island called England, China had risen back up to being the great power it had been for thousands of years. The Chinese forced the British to return Hong Kong to China. So now, for Chinese people to see young protesters on the streets of Hong Kong waving British and American flags is an incredible insult. And the Chinese people, and countless thousands of dissident professors and journalists all over the world, know with a lot of proof that the American government and the CIA is actually instigating these protests in Hong Kong. The American mainstream media answers that by saying, "That's a conspiracy theory! That's a conspiracy theory!" And the way that they're able to get away with that is because we Americans, like I said, don't know about our own history. The United States has actually overthrown about 80 governments since World War II, many of them democracies, and installed quite ruthless dictatorships in their place in order to protect American business and strategic interests. So to say that the CIA is trying to instigate protests that will result in Hong Kong being carved away from China and brought into the sphere as a client state of the American empire is not a conspiracy theory. Now, do the Hong Kong protesters have legitimate grievances? Absolutely. They can't afford to live anywhere in Hong Kong, these young people. There's very few jobs for them. But that's actually the same problem that young people have in New York City or Los Angeles. It's no different in Hong Kong, and the government in Beijing doesn't have much to do with that. Actually, Hong Kong was never a democracy under the British Empire, and there were 10 oligarchic families that go back to the British Empire that pretty much own the whole city. So most of these people can't afford to live anywhere because you have a very small number of people who own everything. That is not going to be solved by carving Hong Kong off from China. They'll still have the same problem with those oligarchs. Now, what you get in all of these, for 8 months, these protests were going on, and what you got was completely one-sided coverage. Night after night, you'd see these protesters on MSNBC or CNN. Oh my God, they're beating us up, they're brutalizing us, the Hong Kong police. Actually, in 8 months of these riots, the Hong Kong police killed no one. And these are not nonviolent protests. This is actually an insurrection. These people are throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Imagine if black people were rioting on the streets of New York City and Los Angeles and they were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. You would have probably hundreds of black men lying dead on the street. The Hong Kong police in 8 months have killed no one. Then, of course, there's the issue of this extradition treaty. The Hong Kong protesters are afraid that the authoritarian government in Beijing is going to start taking everybody away for protesting against the government. Actually, the extradition treaty was withdrawn almost right away, and the main reason for that extradition treaty was because some guy murdered his pregnant wife in China and then escaped to Hong Kong, and the Chinese government couldn't bring him back to prosecute him because they had no extradition treaty. That is the main reason why that extradition treaty was there. And so the protesters used that as a pretext. Now, is it possible that dissidents could be taken away to Beijing? It's possible. But I'll tell you something. Dissidents right here in the United States have more of a chance to be taken away. I personally know dissidents here in the United States, whistleblowers, who have tried to expose crimes of the American empire, who are disappeared or prosecuted. There's the high-profile cases of Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. So that happens here as probably more so than in China. People don't know about it because it usually gets very little press in the mainstream media. But you actually have a lot less freedom of speech than you think you have because you're not really going against the government like some other people are. Let's get back to that basketball game that was played in Shanghai. A couple of years ago, my wife and I did a big tour of China. We flew into Beijing. We took a bullet train out to Xi'an, the original capital of China, where they have the terracotta warriors. Then we flew into the Himalaya mountains to Tibet, to the capital city of Tibet in Lhasa, and we stayed there. Of course, we saw the Potala Palace, this unbelievably lavish giant palace which housed the Dalai Lamas for centuries and all the royalty of Tibet. And who do you think built that lavish palace? When you go to Tibet, all you see is endless yak farmers. Why in the world would these yak farmers want to build this palace if it wasn't forced labor? That's a whole other question, I'm not going to go there. But that was our experience in Tibet. We flew out of Tibet and flew to Chongqing, another Chinese city in the center of the country, where they have this incredible preserve of panda bears, hundreds of panda bears. It's an amazing place. Then we took a cruise down the Yangtze River, a long cruise, and ended up in Shanghai. We walked for days through the streets of Shanghai and Beijing. There were almost no other Westerners around. We walked around by ourselves. We talked to people. It was an amazing experience. And one thing we noticed, there are hardly any black people in China or on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing. And the reason for this is because in the 16, 17, 1800s, when the United States was going to Africa and kidnapping and enslaving people, the Chinese never did that. They could have done that. They were a powerful empire. They were a powerful country. They never did that. They chose not to. So when you walk through the streets of Beijing and Shanghai, you see almost no black people, but wherever you go, you see giant posters and billboards of LeBron James. And at the time, Kobe Bryant, may he rest in peace. The Chinese people are avid basketball fans. And they feel a lot of solidarity with people who have been historically abused by colonialism and imperialism because they themselves were abused by colonialism and imperialism. One other thing about China that I noticed, when you walk around where other posters you would see, when we were told that there was a cult of personality of Xi Jinping. But we hardly knew what Xi Jinping even looked like when we were there. We saw little trace of him, but we also saw posters on every corner of Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken. That was the cult of personality in China. But the Chinese people love basketball, and they have a lot of solidarity with black people, so the NBA will do just fine in China. Most of the players are black. But in that basketball game in Shanghai, there were Chinese protesters outside the arena chanting nationalistic Chinese songs. Some people could not resist going in and seeing the game. This would be the one chance in their life they would get to see LeBron James playing for real, not just on TV. So they went in to watch the game. Inside the game, there was only one chant that was going on throughout the night. Every time LeBron James would come to the foul line to shoot free throws, all the fans would be chanting the initials that stand for most valuable player. MVP! MVP! MVP!